Welcome to On the Ballot with Ballotpedia, where we connect people to politics by providing neutral, nonpartisan, and reliable information on our government, how it works, and where it's headed. I'm Doug Kronaizl. Thanks for being with us. Today, I'm joined by Sophia Voight, who covers politics at the Appleton Post-Crescent, part of the USA Today network in Wisconsin. We came across Sophia's reporting about a month ago in a story she wrote just ahead of Wisconsin's statewide local elections on April 2nd, in which she noticed and documented something that we've been following really closely here at Ballotpedia for a little while now, that more often than not, local elections, especially in rural areas, are going uncontested. Sophia, thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me, Doug.
Yeah, it's fun that we're able to chat about this today. We were talking a little bit before we started recording because here at Ballotpedia, we've also been diving into these uncontested elections. In fact, earlier this week, we posted numbers from April, and they seem to line up with what you were reporting in your story. In Wisconsin, there were like 3,600 elections, and about 2,600 of them, or 72%, were totally uncontested. So while you were reporting this story, how quickly did it become apparent to you that this was happening in rural Wisconsin and that this experience was, pretty severe lack of competition when it comes to their local elections?
Yeah, well, I'm from a rural part of Wisconsin, so I've kind of just noticed this trend since as long as I could vote, and that you don't see a lot of people on the ballots or that you see the same people over and over again. But since becoming a political reporter and having to put together like candidate questionnaires, it's become very obvious that like in our more rural areas, that either no one's running for these races or there's one uncontested person every year.
Well, and you're talking about like candidate questionnaires. I mean, one of the things that we've been really interested in with our expansion of local election coverage is, trying to find ways to get more than just a name to a voter. So you know who's running, but you might know a little bit more about them. But obviously, that could be kind of tough with an uncontested race where you don't really have a choice. Have you, like in your experience covering some of these elections, have you found that it's typically the workflow of just being like, we're not going to worry about sending the candidate questionnaire to, Joe Smith, he's running uncontested, or do you still try to kind of, even if this is the only person on the ballot, try to like give them an avenue to like explain what they will do when they are elected to office?
I think unfortunately the way that like especially smaller newspapers work, we just don't have the manpower to send out questionnaires to every single person running. In April we probably had like near 100 different races and candidates in our coverage area. So if there's an uncontested race, that's kind of an opportunity, unfortunately, for us to not have another piece of workload. If we could, I'd love to send questionnaires to uncontested people because I think those people probably need to keep telling voters why they should be reelected into office. But unfortunately, we're not doing that.
Well, and on the flip side of it, I mean, you could put together these questionnaires and send them out, but then people have to fill them out for them to be of any use. And an uncontested candidate might just say, like, I similarly don't have to take the time to do this. There's no way that I'm going to lose. So there, wash my hands clean of that. Well, zooming out, I mean, we've seen around 3 of every 4 elections going uncontested nationwide so far this year in the reporting and the research that we've been doing, which kind of mirrors very closely to Wisconsin, but then also appears to extend beyond Wisconsin. But what's unique about how this, situation is affecting rural communities from your perspective? Like, do you see that these uncontested races are having an effect, or is there anything that you're able to kind of pull out from how it affects the communities that don't necessarily have a choice when it comes time to elect, people to run the town,
it's definitely
township?
Having an effect on these communities. I guess there's something to say about having people in office for such a long time and like the institutional knowledge that they bring to the role. But then oftentimes it's the same like older white males in these roles for years or even decades, and they're not really bringing new perspectives. They're kind of shelling out the same ideals and stuff. And they might not be representing all the people in their area because they've just been in these roles so long, and they can kind of just get away with whatever they feel is the best way to run the town, and you're not really getting some fresh perspectives into the town. You're kind of approaching issues the same way that you always have been, and that can definitely have a negative or neutral impact on the town, depending how people see it.
But yeah, I mean, the whole kind of idea of like a contested election is that, you've someone over here has a set of ideas that they're kind of, pitching to voters, and someone over here has another set of ideas, and the voters get a pick. But obviously, when that isn't the case, you're not really pitching anything. There's not really anything that you need to sell people on, because, there's not really a choice to be made when it comes time to cast a ballot. Does this trend seem like it's been growing in rural Wisconsin? You mentioned just kind of like noticing it just naturally, growing up, but now are like diving into it more closely through this journalistic lens. Is this something that's been becoming more frequent in your
research
perspectives?
that I did, it does seem to be growing more, especially having like no one running for local elections, because like I said, like a lot of the people who are in these roles for so long they skew older. And as these people are getting ready to retire, there's really no one to fill their positions, because small rural towns are struggling to keep populations, and then especially struggling to encourage people to run for these local elections. So as these rural towns are growing older, you're not getting as many people running for local elections.
Well, and it's I like that you brought that up, because when we're talking about uncontested elections, there's actually two sort of situations at play, right? One is an election where you have as many candidates running as there are seats. Like, you got a city council race, you can vote for two people, and only two people are on the ballot. They just sort of win. That's probably what people think of most when they think of an uncontested election. But like you said, in your reporting, also, you mentioned instances where there might be no candidates on the ballot, or you could vote for two people, but there's only one name there. I mean, just kind of logistically, what happens in those situations?
So in Wisconsin, particularly, if there's no one that has submitted nomination papers ahead of that deadline for an election, you kind of have two options of what local municipalities get to do. And one is you get write-in candidates who they kind of show up last minute and are like, oh, no one's running for this. This is kind of an easier avenue of me to pitch myself for this role, because they don't have to like go collect signatures and everything. So they can just get a bunch of people to write their name in on the ballot. And if they get the top number of votes for that election, then they're in, just the same way as if someone's name was on the ballot. But if there's no write-in candidates, or if people wrote in a write-in candidate and that candidate said, actually, I don't want to do this, then the municipalities will post that elected official or elected position as if it's like just a regular employee that they're trying to bring to the municipality. So then people will submit applications to that role, and then whatever like governing body it is, they'll look through the applications and appoint someone to it.
So it's just like, this is just a vacant seat now, and we have to fill it, sort of deal. Well, that's actually, so one of the things that we saw last year, we ran into one totally wild situation in Kansas. It was a Kansas school board race where I think there was like nobody on the ballot. It was one of those things. Nobody was on the ballot. And there ended up being like a 6-way tie or a 5-way tie for who would get it, between like 6 or 5 people who all had one write-in vote. So it's like those 5 people wrote their own names in, and then the high vote was one. That was the highest vote total. And so there was this tie, and I think they like drew straws or something. But but you're right. Like, it does vary, because like in places that don't have write-in candidates or things like that, then I think a lot of times you see those elections getting canceled. There's one situation in Delaware that we saw this year. It was a town election, where they post the notice and they get nomination papers, and then if nobody runs or if like only one person does, I think they just cancel the elections. But we called to like see whether or not that was the case, and the guy I spoke to was like, no, we cancel it. Like, no one ever runs. If you know anybody who wants to be on the town council, please give them my number, because I'm the only one here. And we keep trying to like ask people to like come be on it, and nobody wants to be on it. So it's like a thing where it's like, even when it is a vacancy, you still got to find somebody who wants to do it. And I think that kind of brings me to like the why, because this, I when we're reporting on uncontested elections and things like that, it's usually just a number. We got like, this percentage or this number. But in your reporting, you were able to go out and you were able to speak with people as to sort of why this might be happening. So what were some of the most common things that you heard from folks as to, why people aren't running for office, or why people don't want to be in these positions?
One of the big things I found was that like people just really aren't that interested in local government. It's a very like thankless job. It takes a ton of hours out of your day, and it's usually unpaid. And if it is paid, it's like $100 a month, maybe. And so people don't really want to spend all their free time reading through a bunch of local legislation and like working on committees when they're not going to get paid. And a lot of the time, people don't really have that ability to do that. They're working full-time jobs. They have families. They can't just kind of set aside numerous hours in a day to be able to do that. And yeah, so
Plus, well, I was gonna say, and plus you get yelled at sometimes, like like people sometimes don't like the things that you do, and like they let you know about it, and so like a lot
of the times people don't even know you're in that position until something goes wrong, and then all of a sudden all of the blame is on you, and you've just been working in this job for so long and no one really noticed you, and then when they find out that you did something they don't like, now it's like the end of the world and everyone's after you. So that's another reason people don't really want to run for these positions.
Yeah, I can see what you're saying, like the thanklessness of it, of like nobody's really like coming and giving you a pat on the back when everything's going according to plan. And also, if you're not getting paid, but like having to put this time in, that can be a difficult bridge to build. Do you have any sense if there's any movement from state or local groups to encourage more people to run for local offices, or maybe make it easier to do so? I feel like that's one of the things that we hear, that we've been hearing a lot more. I mean, a few years ago, people really started focusing on school boards. Ballotpedia, we started covering school boards a lot. And I feel like it's kind of spread out to cover kind of all local politics, in a sense of, people will say like, this is important stuff, but does it feel like there are groups or organizations that are, focused on that? Maybe just specifically in Wisconsin?
I didn't see so many groups that were like, oh, this is a huge problem and we have to find ways to tackle it. I think like on the just local municipality side, like clerks leading up to elections are just like really trying to encourage people to take up this role. There's like putting out flyers, they're putting stuff all over their social media to just like say, hey, this isn't like such a hard job and it's really rewarding. So there's not so many like groups I'm seeing. I know our League of Women Voters in Wisconsin always puts together like toolkits on how to run for these elected positions, just to kind of make it easier for people who are interested. And I think they put on some events on like how to do that as well. But I'm not seeing like any kind of concerted effort. I mean, maybe there's some out there and I hope there is, but I just didn't come across it.
Yeah, it's not so much that there's like groups that are, saying we're going to put this much money and hire this many people, and the whole focus here is just to kind of like fill these spots or fill out these ballots or anything like that.
Yeah, there definitely is that kind of stuff on like legislative statewide races where you kind of have a bit more power. So people do want to put people in those roles. But as far as like local races, especially in rural areas, that's not really getting as much attention.
And now these elections that happened in April, these were the nonpartisan general elections in Wisconsin, the spring general election. Are there any other local elections coming up in Wisconsin?
We have our state legislative races coming up in November. And from what I'm seeing, fortunately, those have actually a lot of candidates in them so far. That's especially because we just got new legislative maps that aren't so gerrymandered. So I think that has encouraged a lot more people on both sides to step up to run for those races. But we don't really have any other hyper local races coming up this year.
Well, whenever you do, crunch the numbers, and we'd be happy to chat with you again and see sort of like how things are going over in Wisconsin. But thank you so much for your time today and chatting with us and walking us through this. Hope to talk to you again soon. And for our listeners, you can learn more about our election coverage at the link in our show notes. Link to the story in the show notes as well. We'll be back next week with another episode, so make sure you subscribe to On the Ballot wherever you listen to your podcast. I'm Doug Kronaizl. Thanks for listening.